Hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and this video will be a thought experiment. Recently, a supposed whistleblower named David Grush was interviewed on cable TV, and this led the U.S. Congress to call for a hearing into UFOs that will or has taken place on July 26, 2023. Grush was decorated for his service in Afghanistan and is a former intelligence official. And in June of 2023, he claimed to have seen documented evidence pertaining to a secret U.S. government UFO recovery program. He claimed that the government is in possession of non-human spacecraft and alien bodies. In this video, we'll explore the possibility that what he's saying is true. But before we begin with this thought experiment, I want to make an observation about epistemology, or how we know things, by lifting an excerpt from the book The New Inquisition by a somewhat forgotten gonzo psychedelic New Age writer named Robert Anton Wilson. The first paragraph of Robert Anton Wilson's book reads as follows. The late R. Buckminster Fuller, architect, engineer, poet, mathematician, and gadfly, used to astonish audiences by remarking casually in the middle of a lecture that everything we see is inside our heads. If the consternation of the audience was voluble, Fuller would stop and explain by drawing on the blackboard the diagram encountered in the elementary optics part of any first-year physics course. In his book, Robert Anton Wilson describes Fuller's diagram in terms of energy clusters, space-time, eye-brain systems, and signals. He wrote, "The brain has already interpreted and edited the signal into its system of classification, which includes turning it around to mesh with the general geometrical system the brain uses to file data." In order to fully understand the meaning of this diagram, Wilson suggests that his reader try the following experiment. Ask a friend to obtain a newspaper you have not already read or glanced over. Sit in a chair and have the friend, holding the newspaper so that you can read the front page headlines, walk slowly away across the room until the headlines are blurry for you. Have the friend turn a page to ensure that you cannot read the headlines. Then, have him, holding the newspaper in the same position, read a headline aloud. You will then see the headline clearly. What Wilson arrives at from this experiment is the idea that our sight, and all of our perceptions, are somewhat conjectural and inferential. However, the 19th century socialist Karl Marx drew a somewhat different conclusion from this diagram. In the German Ideology, he wrote, "Men are the producers of their conceptions, ideas, etc. Real active men, as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces and of the intercourse corresponding to these, up to its furthest forms. Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process. If in all ideology men and their circumstances appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life process." Marx's move was different from Wilson's in so much as he went beyond agnosticism in order to discover the ideological nature of our perception, the way in which our ideas and our perceptions are conditioned in advance, both by our eye-brain system and our social circumstances. For instance, whether or not a friend has read a headline aloud for us or not. By understanding our conditioning, we could understand both how we know the world and how we live in it. In another Robert Anton Wilson book, called Cosmic Trigger, Wilson related the story of a man named Joseph Simonton, who encountered a flying saucer in 1961. Simonton was a chicken farmer in Wisconsin, and he reported that a flying saucer that was brighter than chrome hovered over his house and then landed in the backyard. 3 mute, Italian-looking aliens emerged from the craft, and, without speaking, the Italian aliens proceeded to produce a flameless cooking appliance and began to cook pancakes. Joe may have asked for a pancake, or it may have been the alien's idea to give the pancakes to him. Whatever the case, when the ufologist J. Allen Hynek arrived later to investigate the matter, that pancakes were the only evidence of the contact. Hynek took the pancakes back to the Dayton Air Force Base, where a chemical analysis determined that they were made from wheat germ.
It was a dark night, no moon, and by the way, the winds were fairly calm, which would be again conducive to this sort of thing.
Now, if I were to have been around back in 1961 and could have talked to Mr. Symington, I would have been interested in how his farming business was going. I would have asked him if he'd seen any interesting movies, and I would check out whether he had a television set. I would have wanted to know these things, not because I would be looking for reasons to explain his hallucination necessarily, but because I would want to at least try to understand the social context around this apparent saucer landing and barbecue. Karl Marx's contribution to epistemology is this. He pointed out that our understanding of the world is shaped by the social norms or social relations that surround us, particularly the productive social relations, the relations that create our material conditions. These sorts of conditions might explain why a UFO was reported in 1960s America, while a visitation from the Virgin Mary was reported in Portugal in 1917. In the 60s, the newly emerging consumer culture of post-war America set the context for the flying saucers. Whereas in Portugal, the monarchical order was a living memory, and President Bernardino Machado was soon to face a coup and the rising up of a military dictatorship when the Virgin Mary arrived. At the outset of this video, I said I would try to imagine what would happen if it turned out that David Grush was telling the truth and the US government really had flying saucers in its possession. I could have decided to write this essay about the Virgin Mary instead, and I could have tried to tell a story wherein it turned out that the Catholic God was real. I chose this story instead because it is more proximate to me. I understand it more easily. One reason it is easy to dismiss the Grush story is, in fact, for that very reason. It's too on the nose. It fits our preconceptions about flying saucers, the lore from popular culture, and our cultural imagination generally, too neatly. However, this does make it easier to imagine what it would mean if the story was true, because we have already imagined this over and over again. For instance, in 1977, Columbia Pictures released Steven Spielberg's third theatrical movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It is the story of an electrician in Muncie, Indiana, named Roy Neary, who investigates a large-scale power outage and encounters the UFO responsible for the blackouts. Roy has some sort of psychic connection with the aliens on board, and afterwards is drawn to the Devil's Tower in Wyoming, where he discovers the U.S. Army has already set up a landing site for the flying saucers. After getting past the Army's security and overcoming their attempt to drive away all civilians with the threat of a hoax nerve gas leak, Roy is finally accepted into the select group of bureaucrats that the Army has selected to visit the alien mothership. This is a story of alien visitors who are willing to accept the U.S. Army as a mediator between everyday members of the public, like Roy Neary, and themselves. It is a story of a kind of alien conspiracy with the U.S. state, a conspiracy that doesn't appear to be exactly of the aliens' own choosing, but a necessary precondition for any contact with humanity, given the way all our understanding is mediated by the state, and perhaps specifically the U.S. state, at this stage of our development. If the aliens want to talk and to be known to all of humanity, they will either have to do it through the U.S. state or replace the power of the U.S. state with their own power. This tells us nothing about aliens, but quite a lot about how we both understand and perceive the world, and how we live in it. In his book, Eclipse of Reason, published in 1947, the Frankfurt School Marxist Max Horkheimer wrote the following: "The individual once conceived of reason exclusively as an instrument of the self. Now he experiences the reverse of this self-deification. The machine has dropped the driver, is racing blindly into space. At the moment of consummation, reason has become irrational and stultified. The theme of this time is self-preservation, while there is no self to preserve." What does Horkheimer mean when he says that the machine has dropped the driver? He isn't referring to a literal machine, not even to a flying saucer, but is instead describing the set of social relations that we rely upon to both live in and understand the world. In The Eclipse of Reason, Horkheimer suggests the primacy of the individual self and the aspiration to live in a world founded upon publicly available reason were both the consequences of the liberalism that arose from the Reformation. This liberalism was founded upon the power of labor, power that was, at the start, entrepreneurial. Horkheimer wrote, "Merchant and manufacturer alike had to be prepared for all economic and political eventualities. This need stimulated them to learn what they could from the past and to formulate plans for the future. They had to think for themselves." The individual reason of the entrepreneurial individual, mediated by the market and commerce, provided a foundation for the development of a reasonable society, a society where our social relations were seen as the products of our own choices through history. For Horkheimer, this was a firmer foundation for socialism than the forms of reason that developed as capitalism advanced. The strong and sober ego of the acquisitive liberal maintained interests that transcended his immediate needs, whereas the 20th century individual experiences the world as shrinking and has no longer any use for his or her reason to transcend his or her actual position in reality. The difference between the 19th century entrepreneurial individual who relied upon his own reason and the mid-20th century submissive consumer who only reasons out who and when to submit to some other external authority was not something that arose through breeding or the mere passage of time. Instead, it was the concentration of both capital and power in the state that created conditions wherein individual reason, with its attendant demand to know the world and make personal use of it, could be replaced by unreason. Under the condition of state capitalism, irrationality and a superstitious reliance on authorities took hold, and rather than think for ourselves, we only think of how we might fit into the established order. This perhaps explains why the film Close Encounters is a story of a man who merely intuits what he should do. It is why the story of the individual Roy Neary is a story of a man guided by mystical visions to a landing pad for a UFO. It explains why the only sort of reason to be found in the movie is the bureaucratic and quasi-religious reason to be found within the U.S. military-industrial complex. In 1968, the Trotskyist J. Posadas imagined a different possibility than the one depicted in Close Encounters. He believed that the Fourth International could receive assistance from the flying saucers and create a revolution that would replace the imperial capitalist state with a liberated working class. The UFO would provide the material support needed to transform our social relations around production and our understanding of ourselves and the world at the same time. Back in 1991, when I first encountered Robert Anton Wilson, I imagined a similar scenario during a retreat for an environmental group I worked for. Acid was made available at the retreat, and without bogging you down with the details of my trip, other people's acid trips are as boring and as embarrassing as other people's dreams, I'll just say I imagined aliens were talking to me and to some of my friends. They were going to pick out a new leadership for planet Earth from the group of slackers and ne'er-do-wells I was hanging around with back when Nirvana was new. The primary difference between my hallucination and Posadas' vision was that he had a party that might mediate the relationship between the flying saucers and the general population of Earth, whereas I had to imagine the saucer people taking the lead in replacing U.S. imperialism and capitalism because no alternative political effort existed in 1991. In my imagination, I was reduced to the level of a Gen X version of Roy Neary. On July 26, Congress will hold a hearing on UFOs. If we take it for granted that full disclosure of alien contact will emerge from this hearing, if we grant the UFO story Grush is selling is true, can we imagine an outcome other than the re-entrenchment of power within the U.S. state? Despite the uncovering of the long-standing cover-up, we currently have no other mediating mechanism, no other way to organize ourselves in relation to some outside force or to each other. If the UFOs are real, Biden will still be president, the war in Ukraine will still be on, a recession will still be looming, and most of us will still have to go to work every day. That is, unless we imagine that the aliens are going to impose a dictatorship of the little green men. If the UFOs are real, we will still be tasked with self-transformation and self-emancipation. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.